Firstly, the macro picture. We do know what's been going on in the States and how nervous markets have been. We know that for the longest time, the events in Europe, it's meant volumes have been very low. In Africa, was that still very much the trend last week?
Correct, absolutely so. Obviously, we've only just seen an 11th hour solution to the US debt issue now. So hopefully that spills over into Africa and we see some volume improvement over the next couple of weeks. Hopefully August picks up as well, you know. We'll see a lot of fund managers returning from summer vacation as well. So we're holding thumbs that we see a bit more activity, but to start the week off today looked rather dire in Kenya as well. I mean, only 750,000 US worth of trade done today.
Let's start with the worst performers, because I think there the declines have been quite significant as opposed to the bourses that have done really well. Morocco down 2% in US dollar terms, and it's really a function of Morocco Telecom. It's a large cap stock then?
Correct, it's the biggest stock on the whole market actually. We've got the government selling their 7% stake in the name there as a result of having to raise capital because of big infrastructure spend, and you saw a number of public sector employees getting big pay increases and whatnot. So largely driven by that name. Name sold of about 7.5% as well last week.
Okay, not very good performance in Egypt, also in North Africa, and it's a lot of those political reforms that are not taking shape. What are investors feeling about Egypt?
Well, there's two sides to the coin there. We've seen retail investors come under quite a bit of pressure in Egypt, and they've been net sellers, while we've been seeing foreign institutions and local institutions on the buy side of the market in Egypt. So quite interesting, but volume is very low. As you can see, that's what's driving the name down by retail investors. Okay,
looking at Namibia, which is down 1.8% in the last week, it tends to track the JSE. Now, what is this telling us? Because a lot of our resources stocks are double or dual listed when it comes to Namibia.
Well, firstly, Anglo's is the biggest name in Namibia. Obviously, it's dual listed both here and, as you know, overseas. Big risk aversion taking place across global markets last year. In South Africa, the JSE tends to track these bigger markets. We saw JSE coming under pressure, Anglo selling off, hence the big sell-off in Namibia. I mean, it's about 45% of total market cap, so no surprises there for that name to come under a bit of pressure, yeah.
All right, now Kenya, as you said, again, that bearish trend continuing into this week, and we're hearing it's a lot of functions. Kenya's vulnerable to international issues, but there's a serious drought on the Horn of Africa and Kenya. That's pushing up inflation, and that's not going to change until we just see a little bit more water flow.
Correct. I mean, they rely heavily on their exports of tea, coffee as well, so that's not playing into the hands. Inflation running out of control. Interesting to see last week we had Kenya Commercial Bank report stellar numbers. Unfortunately, the name just couldn't get going. We saw the name say flat at 23 for the week. What impressed us last week, as soon as we saw some international and some local buying interest from the fund management point of view, we saw volumes increase to 7.7 million on the Wednesday. So the appetite is there. I think you know, investors are just being very, very picky and sticky with the levels that they're looking for.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because when you say that, you know, market didn't really respond to the stellar results of KCB, some would argue, we know KCB is going to do well. We know they were going to report double-digit growth for half-year earnings, and so the market had priced that in. The problem with counters like KCB is that the PE ratios are too high for some of these banks, and there's just a sense that they're just looking for more cheaper and affordable valuations.
Correct. I mean, with risk aversion right at the forefront of investors' minds at the moment, I think they have their levels, the big institutional funds, and they're going to stick to that. So I guess they're just waiting for the name to sell off a little bit before they really get stuck in.
Explain to me the discrepancy between the Zim Industrial Index and the Zim Mining Index, because the industrials are down 1.6% in dollar terms, but the mining index, at least in the positive, if not significantly so.
Correct. Well, first let me touch on the mining index. Very, very flat. No major news out last week, but this week we are seeing Wange have their AGM. It's been postponed a couple of times. There's been a lot of infighting with regards to the board members. They want to change boards, etc., etc. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. On the industrial front, we saw EcoNet drive the index down quite heavily. It is the second biggest name on the index behind Delta, so that name sold off quite heavily last week as well. We've been hearing there have been a couple of foreign sellers, yeah, so that's very interesting to see that.
And is that a function of sort of the political temperature in the country? Because we do know that indigenization is going full steam ahead, particularly in the mining sector.
I do think so. I do think there's a lot of risk aversion, especially with regards to that in Zimbabwe, yeah.
Okay, good news stories. Botswana up 1.2% in dollar terms. A diamond company listing there. What else?
Correct. I mean, they're listed on the venture capital board, so it's not really tradable. Barclays did quite well last week. Major driver behind the market there was up about 1%. G4S went into the closed period, so investors seem to like that. Also one of the bigger drivers behind the market there. Pula strengthened, so You know, when you look at the movement, it's a bit exaggerated in US dollar terms because of that 2% increase in the pula against the dollar.
Yep. Ghana, okay. Lots of euphoria and fanfare around the Tullow IPO in the last month, Tullow listing now. It's now really lifted capitalization for this market, liquidity in this market. Was that tangibly the issue here? I
think there's been a lot of excitement behind Ghana. I don't know if the Tullow oil was the major driver behind activity last week. We did see activity increase quite substantially last week. Very happy that there's been able to, you know, increase market capitalization with the Tullow oil listing. It's more than doubled the total market capitalization. But the major driver last week that we saw in Ghana was EGL. We saw a big cross of about 2.6 million shares going on one particular day, traded at about 0.51 CD. Yeah, and that was a 2% increase in the name, so helping the bourse quite a lot there. UT Bank, sorry to interrupt, they also continuing with their share buyback program. Yeah. So that's been a large driver behind the bourse there as well. Name increased 2.7%.
Okay, Zambia, what's going on there? It's up almost 0.5% in US dollar terms.
Yeah, flat, very flat on the week though. I mean, ended 0% up, so nothing serious. We saw vols absolutely die in that market, to say the least. The week before we saw FQM list. There was a lot of activity surrounding that, so it looked like investors were just kind of sitting on their hands last week after the euphoria of that listing.
Okay, what are we likely to see by way of trends in general in Africa this week?
Well, we're hoping with regards to, you know, that the debt crisis has not been solved, but at least we've got some clarity on an agreement to take place. We're hoping to see some vols increase, but like I said earlier, a lot of fund managers and investors still on their summer vacations in the Northern Hemisphere, so we don't see too much activity picking up, hopefully towards the end of the month.
Okay, well, it's great having you. Neil Barnard, who's a trader at Securities Africa.